Supervisors to order, please. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please remain standing. Following the Pledge of Allegiance will be a silent moment of reflection. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And we'll have the reading of the notice, please.
The adjourned organizational meeting of the Marathon County Board of Supervisors, composed of 38 members, will convene at the Marathon County Courthouse Assembly Room, 500 Forest Street, Wausau, on Tuesday, September 26th at 7 p.m., and the agenda was duly signed and posted.
Thank you. I would like to request everyone, please put your cell phones and any other electronic devices on silent or vibrate as to not be an interruption to the meeting, and I thank you for your compliance. And we will move on to item number 5 on the agenda, and that's roll call, and I'd ask the supervisors to sign in, please. Supervisor Arstead.
I'm here, but I can't get mine to work.
Okay. All right, we'll mark you present at this point. If you get it working, let us know, and that way we'll allow the vote to work without requesting you verbally answer. I'd like to welcome all of the visitors that we have this evening with us, and also the viewing audience, and thank you for your interest in county government. And we'll move on to education presentations and/or reports. Item B7 on the agenda, standing committee chairpersons or designees. Any reports by standing committee chairpersons or designees? Okay, we will move on to item C on the agenda, consent agenda, items C8 through items C13A. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Robinson and seconded by Supervisor Seefeld. Any discussion on the consent agenda items C8 through items C13A? Seeing none, we will proceed to vote. Supervisor Book, Supervisor Unger, Supervisor Arstead.
Yes. Thank you, Dan.
Supervisor Arstead, we've got you as a yes. Supervisor Unger. Yes. And Supervisor Book. Yes, thank you. And we'll proceed. And the motion is carried unanimously. Moving on to item D14, a resolution in opposition of COVID-19 mandates. Resolution 50-23. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Cavelli and second by Supervisor Vensky. Supervisor Shafinsky, please. Discussion.
Let me get to the point of the resolution. Sorry, I lost my spot.
If you don't mind, we'll return to you. Supervisor Dickinson.
Please do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did want to offer an amendment to the resolution, and that would add, which I spoke about with corporate counsel. He offered up the language for that within the whereas, and then now therefore be it resolved that we would add the language and employees after residents to both of those paragraphs.
Okay, amendment is being offered as a motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Marash. And if you would wait just a second, we will have the clerk enter the amendment motion to add employees, and then now for there be it resolved after citizens. Motion, and the last two, now therefore be resolved. Offer, motion Supervisor Dickinson, seconded by Supervisor Marash. So now we are on discussion on the amendment. What is your pleasure? Any discussion? Supervisor Robinson, please.
Thank you. My concern with the amendment is the limitations that may impose on our county administration relative to responding to situations. And let me just lay out a couple of those. In our jail, we are in close proximity with relative to prisoners and workers. And we not only have responsibility for our employees, but also for the inmates. And there have been lawsuits filed across the country relative to diseases that are spread or fostered within those environments. We also have people in the health department that work on communicable disease, including tuberculosis and drug resistance tuberculosis. I think we would want to have the requirement that we require people involved in the care of that individual would wear masks. This amendment doesn't reflect that. I would be concerned about how our insurer would react to such provisions, and I think we need to provide to our administration the maximum amount of flexibility to deal with those items to protect the county's interest, and both from a legal and as an employer perspective.
Okay, Supervisor Dickinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There have been no successful lawsuits regarding COVID in that regard that was just mentioned. In addition, there is no mention of tuberculosis in this resolution. What we are looking at here is there have been changes to how the CDC and Department of Health Services have handled masking and isolation and quarantine regarding temperature, fever of individuals who are potentially sick. And what this resolution is addressing is protecting individuals from the choice if they are feeling somewhat ill, if they show up into work, that there should be no requirement for them to have forced testing. There should be no requirement for them to have to be forced masked. There should be no requirement for them to have to be forced isolation, to stay home, which would restrict their ability to earn money and such things. So I think there can be a reasonable thought process within the administration, just like there would be a school or other business, that they can manage their employees to work with them, that they can use good judgment in those situations. And this resolution is about mandating such things 100%, and we don't need that. Thank you.
Supervisor Sherfinsky.
Thank you, Chair. In addition, I think part of the concern was that, if I understood Supervisor Robinson's questions or concerns, is, what about our individuals, our employees that might be in a situation where they are exposed or could possibly expose someone else? There's nothing in this resolution that prevents an employee or would prevent an employee from choosing to wear a mask should they choose to. So I think that also addresses it. You know, it's there's nothing in this that says you can't wear one. So I think that addresses that concern.
Supervisor Lemmer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead, Supervisor. Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to speak from the perspective I'm affiliated with the Wausau Festival of Arts, and in 2021, when we were trying to decide if we were going to have our event, I called the health department and talked to Dale and asked him, can we hold this event? He told me he cannot advise me whether or not to hold the event. It is not the purview of the health department. He said, here's some information you can read. You and your board are going to have to make that decision. In 2020, it was a lot easier because there were more mandated things that said we could not hold the event. So in 2020, we did not hold our Wausau Festival of Arts, and Artrageous did not go on. But that decision came not from the health department, it came from the state. And I feel very badly that people are showing up to ask for this resolution to be made. And I think expecting then the health department is going to be able to stop a mandate or stop a private business from asking their employees to mask or isolate or whatever. I think the better action would be to get a hold of your state or even federal representative and go where this really has jurisdiction. Our health department is not going to make any changes if this resolution were to pass because it is not their purview. So I just would really like citizens that are there tonight to not stop here. If you feel strongly about this non-mandate, you should reach out to your state or federal representative. Thank you.
Supervisor Zhang, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just jumping off Supervisor Robinson's question or remarks here, have we ran this amendment through our insurance, risk management, et cetera, whether this would put us at any risk at all if we were to add the employee portion to it?
Because it was being offered by Supervisor Dickinson, but also through Corp Counsel, I'd ask Corp Counsel if he's got any input to whether or not risk management has had weighed in on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We haven't particularly asked this question of insurance, so I don't have an answer to whether they would weigh in at all. As I indicated on Thursday, this is a policy statement and declaration, so I don't know that it would necessarily have any impact of that nature, but again, I haven't asked that question, so I don't have an answer.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, please.
So if we were in a hypothetical situation where I know our health officers are dealing with several individuals with TB in our area, if a individual ends up referring to this as a reason, this resolution, and for the reason of not masking, are we held at any liability if there was a outbreak of TB in our community here at all?
Again, I'll ask Corp Counsel. I'll weigh in on it's a hypothetical, but yeah. Corp Counsel, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I don't like to weigh in on any hypothetical liability that the county might have, but I'll say we have specific statutes related to communicable diseases and specifically tuberculosis that we would continue to follow regardless of this resolution. So I don't see liability there, particularly with your question as to tuberculosis, but I haven't done the analysis regarding any particular case.
Thank you.
Supervisor Krause, please.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to mention about Mount View. I know that they had to wear masks and they had to go home if they were not feeling well. And that was because of the outbreak. They felt that it would be passed to the patients there in the nursing home, and they're more at risk for catching illness than the average person. And I feel that there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to these new diseases that are coming about. We don't know how necessarily to prevent them, whether shots are accurate or not, whether masks are good. It's just sort of like a question mark with everything. And it is important to prevent people from getting this other diseases. And even in our board meetings, we were encouraged and told to wear masks. So I'm just wondering, we don't know what's ahead. We don't know what kind of diseases are going to come about. We do have a little bit of a handle on COVID, but what about all the mutations and all the things that the shots are doing now? So I think some of it we need to be, we have to care about other people and have precautions. And some of us don't because we don't need to. We're not out in the public. We're not doing things that would cause other people to become sick. Thank you.
Supervisor Sandalski.
Thank you, Chairman. I see the amendment as same. It's protecting the unalienable rights of the people that work for the county, as well as the regular resolution. This is just adding to that. So it's protecting the unalienable rights of the people of the county that work for the county, so they can have a right, whether or not, if they don't feel safe, they can wear the mask, they can stay home, quarantine, whatever they have to do. But we're actually sending a message to this resolution that we're not going to enforce any unconstitutional mandates or take away the unalienable rights of the people we serve. This message is to the state. This message is to the other counties too. Also to the feds, to the public schools, most importantly probably to our sheriff. If you don't know, the county sheriff has the ultimate constitutional authority over enforcement of the law within the county. He has the last say of enforcing laws and mandates within this county. If a state or federal mandate is unconstitutional, it is our sheriff's duty to not enforce them. By voting yes on this no mandates, I am telling Sheriff Billup I back him in upholding his oath and defending the unalienable rights of the citizens we serve here. At the board meeting last Thursday, we had many stories of how people, heartbreaking stories of what happened to people, and their lives were destroyed through all these mandates. So I hope you're going to vote yes on this and do the will of the people and uphold your oath to the Constitution you swore on day one. Thank you much.
Any other discussion on the amendment? Again, this is strictly on the amendment. The amendment is to add including employees to the two provisions in the now therefore be it resolved clause. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. Supervisor, thank you. And we'll proceed. And the motion is carried. Thank you. Now to the motion as amended. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chair, you passed me over in favor of Supervisor Dickinson.
Excuse me, I apologize. You are right. But that vote was taken, and I've announced the results of the amendment, so we're now back to the motion as amended, and I will definitely recognize you, and I apologize if you wanted to speak to the amendment.
No.
Okay. Then the original resolution is still before the body.
Very good. Thank you. And I'd also have an amendment or two amendments to offer. This would be in the two of the final whereas and in the now therefore the final clause. We have two statements, and I'll paraphrase. Board express its position that, unless required by law, Marathon County residents should not have their civil liberties jeopardized by mandates pertaining to face coverings or maskings, vaccine mandates, or forced isolations, and should be free to make their choices regarding, and then it continues on. The amendment I would like to offer is that we strike unless required by law, and should not will be changed to shall not. This would apply to the final whereas clause, and then the paragraph, now therefore be it resolved. So those changes would be made in two places.
I will have the Corp Counsel read the proposed amendment so everyone's clear before I ask for a second.
So I have in the final whereas clause, the Marathon County Board of Supervisors finds it is essential that the board express its position that, striking the next four words unless required by law, Marathon County residents and employees, striking should, changing it to shall, and then the same changes in the now therefore be it resolved clause.
Okay, is there a second? Second by Supervisor Ungerer. Discussion. Let the clerk first get the amendment typed in. Okay, Supervisor, discussion, right? Discussion on the amendment. Any discussion on the amendment? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. Supervisor Baker, please. Supervisor Baker, can you give me your vote verbally?
Yes.
Supervisor Baker votes aye. And we'll proceed. And the motion is carried. And we will proceed on now to the motion as amended. Further discussion. Supervisor Covelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a letter here from the Congress of the United States dated August 16, 2023, to Dr. Lawrence Tabak, Acting Director of National Institutes of Health. It says, Dr. Tabak, Open Books Government Transparency Group recently released a report revealing that from 2008 to 2021, National Institutes of Health employees received over $325 million in payments from private companies in 31 different countries, including some affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party. These payments raise not only national security concerns, but deepen concerns regarding the potential undue influence massive healthcare companies may have over public health agencies engaged in developing and regulating products and responding to public health threats like COVID-19. Of particular concern, companies that were intimately involved with and stood to financially gain from the federal government's COVID-19 response, such as Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech, US, and Johnson & Johnson, provided a number of payments to NIH scientists. Naturally, providing payments to NIH scientists, even if the product was unrelated to COVID-19, raises concerns about the role these companies play in NIH decision-making. Worse still, the Open Books report found that at least 59 payments originated from the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products, a CCP-controlled subsidiary associated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. from which multiple federal agencies now believe the COVID-19 virus initially leaked. However, at the beginning of the pandemic, then NIH Director Francis Collins and then NIAID Director Anthony Fauci dismissed the so-called lab leak theory. Director Collins went as far as calling it outrageous. While the report does not indicate that Dr. Collins or Dr. Fauci received payments from the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products, the NIH close financial ties to the entity and its early dismissal of the lab leak theory cannot be ignored and warrant further examination. It should also be noted that Dr. Fauci, despite being the highest paid employee in the federal government, hauled in at least 37 third-party payments from companies, while Dr. Collins received at least 21 third-party payments. COVID-19 aside, the report raises general national security concerns regarding our public health apparatus, financial ties to our geopolitical adversaries, including the CCP, and companies based in Russia. According to the report, at least 34 different Chinese companies made royalty payments to NIH scientists from 2008 to 2021. And NIH scientists received at least 20 royalty payments from a Russian-based vaccine company that is widely believed to be a secret bioweapon lab. The American people deserve to know that their public health officials follow the science and make decisions based purely on objective information, not personal financial motives. You acknowledge this fact when you testified that royalty payments carry the appearance of a conflict of interest during a congressional hearing last year. As such, we request you respond to the following requests and questions by August 22nd. Did scientists who receive payments from companies that develop COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, or other products play a role in developing NIH recommendations, guidance, public health protocols related to medical countermeasures, including vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics related to COVID-19?
Supervisor Covelli, I'd like you to try to bring that back to the resolution.
This has to do with flow down of information from the NIH to our local health department, as stated by our health officer during the Health and Human Services meeting when she said she gets her information from the NIH. Did scientists who receive payments from companies that develop COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, or other products play a role in advising other public health agencies, like FDA or CDC, on COVID-19 public health protocols related to medical countermeasures, including vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics? If so, please explain and provide all records related to their assessments and recommendations. Did scientists who receive payments from the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products play any role in advising NIH leadership on COVID-19 public health protocols related to medical countermeasures, including vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics? If so, please explain and provide all records related to their assessments and recommendations. What steps did NIH take to address potential financial conflicts of interest related to recommendations or positions regarding COVID-19? Describe the nature of all personal administrative adverse actions NIH has taken against NIH employees related to conflicts of interest created by receiving a third-party payment and review of a product since passage of the Bayh-Dole Act. Provide information about each investigation of NIH scientists due to the conflict of interest concerns and include the NIH Office of Ethics or NIH Office of Management Assessment. Please describe each conflict of interest concern NIH has referred to the HHS, OIG, and the results. Please provide a fully transparent accounting of the company, product, date of disbursement, scientist name, and the amount of all third-party payments received by NIH employees. Has the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Commerce Department, or any other national security agency reviewed and cleared requests for NIH current or former staff to accept royalty payments directly from businesses in China or Russia or other countries of concern where the companies are an extension of the communist government? What steps has NIH taken to ensure that NIH employees do not become compromised by our geopolitical adversaries through third-party payments? How can NIH mitigate, limit, or eliminate even the perception of pay-for-play and conflicts of interest through third-party payments to NIH employees? Will NIH commit to annually releasing a report on third-party payments to NIH employees? We look forward to your prompt answers to the above questions. In Congress, we will continue to work to ensure that any future public health legislation includes COVID accountability and properly disentangles big healthcare from the public health bureaucracy responsible for regulating it. And this is signed by 14 different members of Congress. In further research, just last year in 2022, I found that $58,975,294.40 in 753 payments were paid to the NIH. The top company that paid the NIH was Pfizer Incorporated at $30,360,099.95. And it goes down from there. Thank you very much.
Supervisor Stravinsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Supervisor Covelli raises another issue, and basically it's somewhat tangential to what I would like to address as I speak in support of the resolution, and that is when COVID burst on the scene, there was a great amount of panic, if you will. Some of it artificially generated, some of it just generated kind of spontaneously, and a lot of lack of information, lack of clarity, lack of clear direction, a lot of misinformation. The end result of where we were then versus where we are today is that a large majority of our citizens here in Marathon County have made it very clear that there is a very great lack of trust. A great deal of trust has been lost, both in terms of the federal government and looking at the federal bureaucracy from a medical perspective. Think FDA, NIH, all of the health bureaucracy. That lack of trust also extends downward to the state and local governments, to the local health department, to the state health department, and so on. People have a great deal of concern at this point. A lot of autonomy was unduly and unconstitutionally ripped from people's own hands, and they were told what they were going to do on information that turned out to be woefully inaccurate. So somebody earlier mentioned, why are we here? Why are we talking about this? Isn't this more properly addressed to the federal level or to the state level? And there's absolutely, those are avenues that as citizens we should all take. We should express concerns and doubts to our federal officials, to our state officials. But we as county officials have an avenue open to us to, as a county, express to the state government and to our legislature that we are not going to sign on for any mandates going forward, that we're just not going to enforce that. That is one avenue that we can express. As the saying goes, my body, my choice. Now, some people have used that in other contexts, but in this case, it also applies, because we're not telling anybody that you cannot wear a mask, that you cannot get vaccinated. Do whatever you feel makes sense for you and makes you feel comfortable and you think will protect your health, life, and safety. But what we are saying with this mandate or this resolution is we are telling our state officials that we are not going to accept an unconstitutional state mandate going forward again. Thank you.
Supervisor Baker, please.
Thank you. On Thursday, I asked a question, and I know that Corp Counsel has spent some time researching the answer, so I would like to give him an opportunity to answer that, and then I have 2 follow-up questions.
Okay. I turn it over to Corp Counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I guess I would ask him for the question to understand what the question was that he's responding to.
Absolutely. Supervisor Baker on Thursday raised a question which was about particularly back in, I believe, 2020 or 2021, there was a hotline established by the health department relative to reports of folks who were not masking. And his question was about, what was the authority for that? So I did have a chance to look into that. I spoke to our Sheriff Billup, who was chief deputy at the time, as well as our health officer, to kind of understand more about what was going on at that time. Sheriff Billup shared that initially this came about after our sheriff's office was receiving reports of people not masking through the 911 call center. So the sheriff's office was seeking a way to encourage citizens not to use 911 to report those what are clearly non-emergency observations. The health department then established the call line to divert those calls from the emergency line. So that's my understanding of the rationale. I don't know at the time what the discussion was of the authority. Wisconsin statute section 25203 does require the local health officer to take all measures necessary to prevent, suppress, and control communicable diseases, so it would provide some authority to establish something like that. However, there is no authority to follow through with enforcement relative to not wearing a mask pursuant to those mandates, so there was no enforcement tied to that hotline. I don't believe there's any legal authority for the health officer to take enforcement action relative to reports of people not masking. So that's what I found and provided to Supervisor Baker relative to that question.
Thank you. So my first follow-up question is, during your research, did you find any evidence of a statute or ordinance that required us to offer that tool?
I did not.
So given that that was done without requirement, and given that there were comments that this resolution would have no impact on the county, would you agree that since the county took action that it was not required to, that a policy statement such as this would certainly have the potential to have an impact on the county's actions going forward?
I think from a policy perspective, I think the document provides guidance to staff about what the board's policy is in this area, so I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Okay, we will proceed to vote. And we'll proceed. And the motion is carried. Thank you. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, and that is a Public Safety Committee and Human Resources Finance and Property Committee, a resolution authorizing the expenditure of ARPA funds for Phase 2 design services for the Regional Forensic Science Center, Resolution 52-23. What is your pleasure? Supervisor Zhang with the motion, Supervisor Vensky with the second. Any discussion? Any discussion? Okay, this does require a 2/3 majority vote, so I did want to inform the board of that. Seeing no discussion, we will proceed to vote. And we'll proceed. And the motion is carried unanimously. Moving on to the Administrator's 2024 budget message. I will turn it over to the Administrator, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, members of the County Board and members of the public that are here. I'm happy to provide an overview of the proposed budget that was turned over this afternoon, THR Finance and Property. And if I could have Chris and Christy come on up, we're going to try to take this as a team here. And that's a perfect segue for my first comments, which really relate to the fact that the team that put this budget together really, from my perspective, and I know I'm biased, but they did a fantastic job. I want to give credit to Christy, her staff, Chris Buskirk, Season, Danielle, and everyone in that office. Molly Adzik from Employee Resources and her staff. Certainly Chris with the facilities team. And of course, Sarah Severson from our office, that she did an exceptional job putting this together. And over the last several weeks, the team really has put in more hours than I care to admit. I thank them very much for their diligence to do that. Christy and I were just talking about, we were working all weekend, late last night, sending emails. It's been a lot of late nights and long weekends to get this to you in compliance with the budget timeline that you set out for us earlier this year. And I'm proud that we were able to meet it. So if you look in your packet today, the third to last page in that packet has, it's a nondescript page with a link. And that link is to the document that is up on the screen today. We'll go through the budget presentation, not in excruciating detail, I hope. It is, I believe, about a little over 140 pages to kind of really tell more of the story of what kind of went into the budget development and what impact it has on the community, and certainly some high points for the county board. But this was no small task, and I want to, again, thank the team. There was one component you guys have heard, certainly Christy and I talk about this before, but our financial system historically was just about ready to qualify for Wisconsin retirement. It was almost 30 years old. Going through this process, however, with a new tool, this first budget, I will say there were times when I know staff were thinking, geez, if I only had Kayenta back. I don't think that's going to be the case moving forward. Having gone through this process, I think everyone sees the light at the end of the tunnel of how powerful this tool is going to be, and I'll highlight a little bit about that as we go through the process and do the presentation here today. But make no mistake, and I want to, again, give kudos to the team. In the short term this year, it was exceedingly difficult. And Christy will talk through a little bit later in some of the last pages of the budget why, in a lot of respects, this really is a fresh start, which I understand can make it challenging because it really doesn't compare well to previous years. Because as part of our work, we had to essentially remap everything. Our chart of accounts was entirely redone to mirror the state of Wisconsin, to eliminate a lot of complexity. And a lot of the things that existed in previous budgets really don't dovetail nicely with our new system. That being said, moving forward, I think everyone on our team sees the benefits. So for our presentation today, I'll walk through, I can't say briefly, but I'll walk through the operating budget. I'm then going to turn it over to Chris to talk through the capital improvement program and the funding strategy for that. And then I know Christy has some things to present on based on some questions that have previously been raised, and also, again, to highlight some of the things I already referenced with the new system and how this might look and feel different. So when I start going through this presentation, I'm going to start with some strategy behind building the budget. After I talk briefly about those highlights of kind of what are the messages, the takeaways, I'll go through, like I said, the strategy, and then we'll turn it over to Chris to talk through some of the capital pieces. So what is the big takeaway from the budget? It is going to be a non-sexy tagline, but this is a status quo budget. That's just the simplest way to phrase what we're talking about. There are no new programs or services. There are no significant increases in services. There are no new positions, and in fact, I'll talk a little bit more about, if anything, it is in fact a reduction through some formal abolishments and unfunding of already allocated positions. But the resounding theme here, apart from status quo, is I'm very proud of our team. We tried to follow, and in fact we did follow, all of the guidance that we received from this county board. We understood that as part of your effort to really redesign the budget process, the budget development process, you gave us budget priorities, budget assumptions, and guidance relative to capital. We really worked very diligently to incorporate all those things, and throughout the 146 pages that you'll have the opportunity to read, I tried to highlight where those guiding principles were coming from each of those sections. But really succinctly put, it is a very status quo budget. The only nuance I'll say is that in terms of strategic direction, we did have a lot of conversations with department heads about how to follow through on some of those efficiency measures that were, again, within the budget priorities that the county board put forward. So other takeaways. I think the real a takeaway, it's very consistent with if you watch the audit presentation at HR Finance, Marathon County, certainly as an organization, but also as a community, I think the takeaway for everyone in this room is that we are in a very strong position. And I think a couple of statistics bear that out, and they're at various points in this budget document. But net new construction. Last year, our net new construction value was 1.72 in terms of net new construction value. That put us actually outside of that top quartile. If you look at the green book that you all received, we were outside that top quartile in reporting. When I went through and hand counted, we were outside the top 15 is the easy place to put it. And I don't think that's a place where Marathon County, certainly from my perspective, and I know the board's perspective is we want to be a leader, as oftentimes is the case. We look to that vision on the back wall. I know a number of supervisors have referenced it. It's not to be in the middle. It's to be the healthiest, safest, and most prosperous. So when you talk about prosperity, we want to have a net new construction value that's higher. This year, very happy to report net new construction value of 2.32%, ninth in the state of Wisconsin. I think everyone can be proud of that. So what that means is that there's economic growth happening, and I'll talk about that when I get to sales tax. We have strong property values, which, as you've discussed at this body and some of your subcommittees, sometimes can create some challenges. But this is a place where businesses and people want to be, which is a very good thing. So that's one kind of big takeaway as you have conversations with constituents, and how that bears out in terms of our management and our prosperity, how Marathon County governs itself, certainly is borne out by our tax rate and our commitment to be a leader within north central Wisconsin. And for a lot of reasons that I don't want to belabor the point, sometimes some comparisons with other counties are a bit challenging. You look at Waukesha or any of the larger counties with a more with smaller footprints relative to agricultural land use. I mean, that's just a function of the state legislature and the tax system. Our tax base is never going to be the same as one of those more densely populated counties. But when you look at our region as a function of this budget, and I hate to jump ahead, but I'm going to, the tax rate for this proposed budget is down just above 20 cents, 20.1 cents from your last year's budget, $3.99. It's the first time we've ever been below the $4 mark, and as far as I can tell from the history of the county, below all of our surrounding peer counties, which again I think is a good measure. It speaks to our strong fiscal management. Another piece, and I included this for the first time this year, is our per capita government expenditures, according to the Green Book, is $900, ninth lowest in the state of 72 counties. So a lot of good things relative to the state of Marathon County. So as I said in going through the budget message, I'm going to talk about some strategies, but I always put in my letter some key investments in the areas of our people, our infrastructure, and opportunities for innovation, as well as what do we do to mitigate risk. I won't go through all those at this point, but I'll pay reference to them as we go through. But when we look at that forecast, again, that we see that drop to $3.99, that's about a 4.8% reduction in tax rate. As all of you know, the tax system in the state of Wisconsin, tax rate and tax levy, they are intertwined, but certainly different concepts. The overall levy is increasing, but that is a function of, as I reference here, it's a function of the net new construction. It's a function of an increase in the library levy and an increase in levy relative to debt service. There is a small reduction in the bridge and culvert aid program that each of you just voted on earlier today. This has been a line that has been in, I think, every budget message since 2010 or before, and I've continued my predecessor's practice of including it. Essentially, if you want to argue you cut taxes or you want to argue that they went up, both can be true based on how you argue. And that really is a function of Wisconsin's levy limits and the Wisconsin levy law and how those things work together. So what does that mean for your average homeowner? These are two charts that have that I included last year. Was the first year I included the chart on the right. The chart on the left has been a long-standing chart. I've actually had, since we've been using this, I've actually had a couple of interactions where people have pointed out that, and I think it's absolutely true, it's a very apt analysis, neither one is really likely to be any one of us in this room. It shows, again, that interplay between those things that I talked about. You know, the function of equalized value, that is the overall equalized value of all properties in the state of Wisconsin, which we don't have control over, that's Department of Revenue that has control over that, and how taxes are apportioned. Taxes are apportioned at the lowest level, they're at the municipal level, so we utilize equalized value, but then if you live in, say, like I do, I live in the city of Wausau, my taxes are apportioned at the local level based on assessed value. So there's a lot of things that play into this, and I won't belabor the point. If you want to learn more, Wisconsin Policy Forum has two very good articles that they just, again, recently released. They're a bit old, but they make the point of as to some of those challenges in conflating those two pieces. But I do want to talk about what can you see with respect to those impacts. So if you're in a municipality where there was a recent revaluation, that is, they come back and do a reevaluation of all the properties, right, to make sure that you're properly assessed, or you just bought your home, or you had work done to your home which caused it to be reassessed, you're probably going to be more likely to fall on the left chart. And that is, hey, you're being brought up to that equalized, a more equitable assessment of taxes. If you haven't, your community hasn't done any eval, you haven't done anything to your house, and maybe your property isn't being assessed and growing in value at the same rate of those that surround you in your municipality, more likely to be on the right chart. So in speaking at least with a constituent earlier this year, we were having a conversation about the average homeowner impact and how it's oftentimes the case that the tax rate goes down, but individual homeowners might see an increase in taxes. They replied, actually, no, my tax bill went down. It's not because the chart on the left is bad. It's because based on their circumstances, they fell more on the chart on the right. In any event, the charts are instructive, and I actually had a really good conversation with a colleague of mine, and this is a document that we're going to make available for you at the conclusion of the board's decision on final budget adoption. I think it's really insightful when you look at the county share of a tax bill, and there's various tax amounts that are referenced on each of those charts. But when you think about a $200,000, wouldn't we all like an $800,000 house? A $200,000 home, assuming you're the average homeowner on the left, recent reval in your community, your tax rate of $399 equates to just under $80, $78-ish a year. When you look at that in a month, $66.50. The county share of a tax bill, is $66.50 on a $200,000 house. Probably what you or I just actually looked at my internet bill last week, and it was pretty close to that, so I'll have to call them back and see if I can get the introductory price again. But there's a lot of good value that comes from the county services that we provide, whether it's highway, our sheriff's office, certainly our parks department. Really and I say this every time I do new employee orientation in this room, from the day someone is born in Marathon County and their birth certificate is logged at our Register of Deeds until perhaps our staff from our medical examiner's office deal with them on the day they leave this earth. It's highly likely that everyone, while they're in this county, is interfacing with a public service that we provide. So I think that's a great metric to remember. Certainly the property tax bill, I know when I get it, I still look at it even though I know what's in there. The county share is only a portion, quite honestly, a small portion. But there really is a lot of great value that comes from that. So that's two things I want to talk about when you look at those charts. Then I'll just quickly go through this budget book from an operating perspective to try to talk through some of the highlights. Won't belabor this point. You made it very clear as a board, don't spend working capital. I gave you a history of our use of reserves to balance the budget. There are a couple years where that's happened. We did not do that in this budget that's proposed to you. Adjustments made to balance the budget. And this, I included a couple things in here that I want to be very transparent. They're not adjustments, perhaps, as you might think about them, where I say, hey, I'm going to cut $500,000 or $10,000 from a particular line. There are some in there that I'm going to talk about that are like that. But this first one is really more of that strategy that I alluded to before in developing this budget. And I gave a lot, as I do each year, but I gave a lot of, I trust our department heads to do a very good job. I expect them to do a very good job. And I gave them all of the information that all of you provided relative to budget priorities and budget assumptions. And I challenged them through my budget letter to really look for efficiencies, think differently. You've talked a lot about revenues. Challenging people to think differently about their budgets. And this is one that I want to make specific reference to. In the last several budget messages, this first billing in the adjustment section referred to, within our highway department and our sheriff's office, the practice of budgeting for attrition. Essentially saying, we know we're going to have vacancy, we're going to have turnover, let's cut some money out of the budget. When the sheriff's office met with, their leadership met with Christy and I, and we went through their budget, they approached it differently. And I will tell you, I made no adjustments, at least I can't remember that I made any, to their budget. They did a great job, but it is a different way than we'd done it in the past. And I give them credit. I think it's certainly going to be a challenge, but I want to talk you through a little bit about what that difference is. We budgeted for full staffing within the sheriff's office, and we are developing a plan to get there. But the reasons for why to be fully staffed are tied much more to revenue than they are expense. There still is an expense component, make no mistake about it. But again, credit to the leadership within that department, and all of our departments did similar things. But this is a very fundamental shift where we move from looking at housing out inmates as purely on the expense side. Some of the contracts, and I make reference to the inmate services contract, we have a better revenue when we are full. And we've had this discussion at public safety to this point, some of our challenge recently has been we don't have the staff to have all of the inmates in our facility. We're not unique in that, but as I go through these things, you start to see really what the potential is if we are able to be fully staffed. We have to develop a strong plan, and I know Supervisor Shafinsky is going to say, what are your dates? We're going to get there. I don't have them for you today, but we have been talking about how do we do that. We've engaged some recruiters, but you can see through these things the opportunities that exist. And I just want to mention the security detention facility in a little bit more detail. This was one of the things that administration and the sheriff's office were tasked with early on when I became administrator. And that facility, I think we are now seeing as a true opportunity. As I allude to in the message, the number of these facilities across the state of Wisconsin continues to reduce. So as the supply goes down, the demand for these types of facilities go up. And That is why it's really important for us to maintain full staffing in the adult facility, just behind everyone, because if we can do that, we don't need to pull staff from our juvenile facility to our adult facility, which had been our historic practice. You may recall we closed that juvenile facility. We are doing exceedingly well on revenues. And at the standing committees, as you have questions about the specific performance within each individual department, I encourage you to ask questions, but we're projected to have over $1 million of revenue over expense. Because there are just not enough of these. You may recall there used to be secure SRCCCYs was a thing they wanted to, the state was going to close Lincoln Hills and have these regional facilities. There's not enough people interested in doing them. It's hard work, but we do it well. And it really plays into that idea. If we look at revenue and our opportunity to generate revenue, we need to invest in recruiting. So we budgeted for full staffing because if you look at the state of Wisconsin budget, corrections officers, the equivalent of corrections officers in the prison system, got over a 40% starting wage increase. Went from $23 an hour to $33 an hour. We know that central Wisconsin counties have been talking about, and at least one has already made some movement with respect to their starting rates. If we budget for attrition, we have no revenue no money with which to make in-range adjustments. So, as I said before, I think the sheriff's office proposal was logically very sound. We'll work to develop the plan to get there, but I ended my comments with, we didn't factor in the potential savings of if we are able to both manage our jail population, which I talk a lot about later, and manage our staffing. You can negate, in a perfect world, $600,000 of expense as well. So there's a lot riding on our sheriff's office operations, and I credit them with the budget proposal. Now we just need to make it happen. The library budget reduction. This is one of those areas where I just say, hey, I'm cutting an allocation. I won't belabor the point. I set a reserve target after speaking. This is a couple of years ago. In 2022, we initiated this, really to try to get at this idea that, unlike all of our other departments, once funds are allocated to the library, they stay there. That's state statute. So we set a target. What should be the reserve target? And the library staff have done a strong job of managing that budget. Last year, we cut $419,000 total from their budget request. It's a very significant cut based on that reserve balance. Not surprising that reserve balance dropped. They dipped into that reserve to do exactly what our plan was, which was to have them utilize that for operations. So that reserve balance is lower, but I do reference it's projected to be at $361,102, which is above my $300,000 target. So I cut $61,102 from that request. Social services. Similar to our experience with the jail, I challenged the Department of Social Services to really take a good hard look at placements. And there's a graph in the chart, there's a graph within the document that shows you how we're managing that. We are continuing to work to keep kids in the lowest level placement possible to maintain their safety. It's a court decision what placement a child is put in, and it will be appropriate. But our staff can do a lot in terms of safety planning to keep those kids in the least restrictive setting possible. Our social services budget is an investment in that. It's nearly $500,000 below what their budget was in 2023. Sales tax. I know in our budget assumption setting, the county board set conservative sales tax numbers of $15.75 million. This is one of those areas where I know that was your assumption, and I think this is the only one where I'm being very transparent. I upped our sales tax projection. I still think it's very conservative, more conservative even than past years. But I want to tell you, I want to be very upfront with you why I did that. First, that I did it, and then secondly, why. I increased it to $16 million from $15.75 million. took that $250,000 and we put it towards debt service. So as I'll talk about later in this budget, our debt service is being covered by a significant amount of sales tax, $3 million. Our projections are still well below what our forward analytics numbers are. In fact, they're about 7.73% below the estimates that were released, and I linked to that as well. But the ability to put debt service, utilize sales tax to service debt, the $3 million in debt service that we're using sales tax to service, that's about 20.6 cents on the levy. So a very substantial amount. Number 5, in terms of adjustments, I'll talk more about this later, but we have allocated positions that are not funded. And that's a credit to the departments that I'm going to talk about. They have been vacant. These positions have been vacant for, in some cases, a couple months, some a little bit longer. They have found efficiencies. That does not mean that these positions aren't important and that we wouldn't like to fill them to utilize some work and that we really need to tackle. But we left them unfunded in the budget because I think there's an opportunity to consolidate, particularly the 3 positions. Credit again to County Clerk's Office, Register of Deeds, and Corporation Counsel. I think we can consolidate, those 3 into 1. And I'll work with those 3 department heads to do that and identify a funding source. I referenced just some areas where I think there's opportunity for alignment. It's kind of as the work ebbs and flows in one department, to the extent we can consolidate, we can have more of a steady stream of work. So Kim this year has got just a couple of elections she's going to have over the next several months. That's going to be busy more so than, we're on a presidential cycle, right? More busy than perhaps normal. As tax collections come in, we have kind of busy periods and then legs. Corporation Counsel's office with our tax delinquent property work. So I think there's an opportunity to do that. The other department that we're not funding a position that has been allocated is Conservation Planning and Zoning. And I think with the proposed relocation of Conservation Planning and Zoning to the Lakeview campus, I think there's more opportunities for them to be near other departments where your position sharing is, those opportunities are enhanced. And then last, but certainly not least, this idea of allocation of indirect and support costs for various departments, and I specifically mentioned solid waste. This has not been an area where we've been overly consistent. And I think there's a real opportunity for us. And I end my comments in this section saying we're certainly not perfect in this first step that we're taking, but it's a first step and we'll refine it moving forward. But I focused on 3 areas of departments. We have a lot of different types of departments that we utilize to deliver services. We have departments that serve multiple jurisdictions. So Central Wisconsin Airport, the Aging Disability Resource Center of Central Wisconsin, City County IT, North Central Healthcare, Parks, Recreation, and Forestry, and even solid waste. And you might ask, well, solid waste is Marathon County. Yes, but we have agreements with other counties, Portage and Shawano, to offer a lower cost to take waste than perhaps a private provider may. So we're again serving multi-counties, or with respect to Parks, Rec, and Forestry, the city of Wausau and Marathon County. Allocating direct services is a step in the right direction because it ensures that Marathon County taxpayers aren't carrying more of the burden, for lack of a better way to phrase it. Similarly so that's the first kind of group of departments we have focused on. Second is those groups that serve as an enterprise. They operate, operating much like, in many ways, like a business. Solid waste and to an extent, Parks, Rec, and Forestry. Better transparency, better understanding of true costs of service delivery. And then lastly, those departments, as I alluded to before, that have their own independent reserves. Those are North Central Healthcare and the Marathon County Public Library. Ensuring that reserves only grow after indirect services and support costs are paid is just good business sense. So we're taking a step in the right direction. The biggest example of that is solid waste. This has been, again, from the moment I came into administration in 2016, I think, as the deputy, this idea has been discussed. And the reference is often made to a neighboring county where their solid waste department pays in $200,000 to the general fund. So that's what I put in our budget, is a $200,000 payment from solid waste to the general fund. I know and I referenced this in here, that is not a small transfer. Solid waste, if you look at the audit and their balance sheets, they have recently had a lot of large projects. At the same time, I think timing is good, as I referenced in my letter. Just earlier this year, working with solid waste, Mike and I were able to renegotiate our purchase of our gas rights, and then of course the sale of those rights for $300,000. On the low end, we are guaranteed $300,000 of new revenue. That wasn't part of the plan 18 months ago, so the timing is right. You're getting $300,000, we're taking $200,000, and those revenues should grow under those agreements. But I think that's a fundamental shift in strategy that we haven't had before. And again, my commitment is we'll get better as we go on. American Rescue Plan Act, again, I won't belabor this. We've talked a lot about it. I just want to highlight in the middle of the page when Chris talks about the allocation of ARPA funds as part of our capital project funding plan this year, there is still $3.135 million that is unallocated. And again, that's in keeping with this idea through your budget kind of revisioning process to have the board have more opportunity for strategic control of the budget. I think that's a great opportunity to do that through those ARPA funds. This is a section I added last year that I built on this year, outstanding county bonds and notes. There's been a lot of discussion about debt service, and I think it's extremely important that the county understand and develop a process moving forward. This year, as I alluded to before, there's $7.7 million of debt that is being serviced by the county, and I talk about how that's being done. $3 million is sales tax. I referenced that before. $2 million is a payment from North Central Healthcare. Of that $2 million payment, I think it's important to note over $900,000 is a function of Marathon County increasing its levy to North Central by a concurrent amount. So we're essentially writing the check. They're turning around and using part of those funds or all of those funds to service some of that debt. $150,000 then in miscellaneous revenue, and then there is $2.55 million on debt service. I understand that's a lot. That's why I upped the sales tax to decrease that initial kind of increase in debt service. But I put this summary chart on the right side of this in the budget book because that obligation that Marathon County has is not going away. You have a $7.7 million obligation all the way through 2029, then it drops to 7.2, 6.8 the successive year, and you have an obligation of approximately $5.8 million from 2032 until 2042. I built the budget with that long-term obligation in mind. That is a significant amount of debt, and I wanted to make sure that the county board understood where our total debt obligations come from. I say that, and then the next slide is actually not included in that summary slide, and there's a reason for it. It's airport debt, but I wanted to be very transparent and let you know there is Marathon County outstanding debt that's held by the airport and serviced by the airport, but those amounts have been historically serviced by the airport, and they will continue to do that. But the next slide on page 17 is all of our debt service schedules for all of the borrowings that were adopted by a 3/4 majority of this board in previous sessions. There was I know Supervisor Marash had a question about what borrowings related to North Central Healthcare in some previous conversations we had. So if you look at the top of these schedules, the GO promissory notes or GO capital improvement bonds, those are Marathon County, those were for Marathon County specific projects. When you look and you see GO healthcare project building bonds, those are North Central Healthcare. So it kind of lays out what borrowings and what debt service schedules apply to both the county and North Central. Those are rolled up into that summary slide I had, or summary page I had before. They're also reflected in the bottom right corner of total with principal and interest that is set forth there. Quick math, it's not in, it's accurate, it's not precise, but over 40% of the debt that's on this page in front of you is for Marathon County specific projects. The remaining portion is for North Central Healthcare. But I wanted to let you know kind of where that debt has originated and when, and what the schedules look like for each of those obligations. New positions, I referenced this already. You gave clear direction, and we followed through on that. There are no new positions funded in this budget, and I already made reference to the unfunded positions that remain allocated. I want to talk about this chart that has historically been in our budget, and of course, it's still there. So, but I want to be, again, this is an opportunity when I talk about the value of our workday system moving forward. We all see these benefits because there has been a lack of consistency. I talk about allocated and funded. There have been occasions in the past where budgets, that chart includes, it doesn't include positions that are unfunded. But that's really not what the chart is supposed to be. This is a full-time equivalent chart. So the lack of consistency, I am very happy to say, is over. Workday is going to help us. We have set a policy. This chart in the budget is always going to be the full-time equivalent allocations by department. We've also made another important change here, and that is library has historically been above the total line. We moved it below, and the reason for that is very similar as to why Central Wisconsin Airport and ADRC are below the line. Once you allocate money to the library, as I said before, they get to spend it. You have a library board. I see Supervisor Book is here, as is Supervisor Gisselman. They serve on the library board. They get to spend that money, whether they want to have an FTE, a 1.0 FTE, or split that up and have 3 employees. They make those changes without going through the process that other departments go through under section 4.20 of your ordinances. So they're like they're like Central Wisconsin Airport and ADRC in that respect. So we move them below the line. We still report the changes they make. The other important thing I want to reference here is we did abolish a number of positions as part of this budget. So under your ordinances, I have the ability to abolish a position. I can't create one, but I can end them. And working with departments, we cleaned up this chart. We have had a number of vacant positions that haven't been filled for a while. They're gone, where we know they're not going to be utilized. So we had a portion of an administrative specialist position within the sheriff's office that we cleaned up. That's why they're down 0.44. They also had a new deputy position, so that's why it's not a 1-to-1. We had a similar situation within the health department. They had a public health educator position that was vacant for a period of time. We eliminated that position, so you'll see they're down 0.93. So we really use this, as I said before, with Workday. This is our true up. These numbers moving forward are the numbers. These are the full-time equivalent positions. And why that's important, and I don't want to get in the weeds, but if we have an employee who it's a 1.0 FTE position, but we underfill it because the person is really, really good, but they only really want to work 35 hours a week, we will underfill that position if we can accomplish the work. But we still are going to report 1.0 FTE because we want to be very transparent with you. That's what this chart is. We are also going to continue this idea of clearly noting less unfunded positions at the bottom. I already referenced the 4, won't go into them again, but you'll also see there are some positions within those other departments that I referenced where Central Wisconsin Airport, ADRC, and Library are reducing those FTEs. But moving forward, consistency will be the aim. Employee health insurance, won't belabor this point. It's been talked about a lot at HR Finance and at the full board. Health insurance is a significant cost for the county, just like any employer. Some of our municipal neighbors have received quotes of double-digit renewals, thankfully. The best investment we've made through the budget recently has been the consultant that we've utilized. We got a renewal of 6.5. There's still more work to be done. Make no mistake. I know a number of supervisors have reached out and wanted to do a full, more deep dive with respect to the entire plan design. I think that's a great idea. I continue to be of the position that moving to a self-funded plan for an organization of our size is the right move. As I reference in here, this wasn't the year based on claims experience. We need to have a really good handle on what our claim experience is likely to be. And the second part is we also need to identify a funding source for the creation of a reserve account. Standard practice is 25% of your yearly claims, which for us, again, ballpark, it's not precise, but it's accurate. You're in excess of $3 million. So it behooves us to have a full plan before we move in that direction, but I still think it is a very solid plan. I have the chart in front of you in the budget book to talk about kind of what that current plan design looks like. Compensation, you gave clear direction through the budget priorities and budget assumptions up to 3%. And I explained for you within this section why I think 3% is absolutely necessary. I think everybody can attest, whether personally have been affected through a workforce shortage within their business. But there's a lot of opportunity out there, and I try to give some background as to why I think that might be part of the challenge. Certainly it's a demographic issue, but locally within central Wisconsin, this isn't a central Wisconsin problem. It's not only a Wisconsin problem, a nationwide problem. But I do think our challenge in north central Wisconsin is a little bit perhaps more challenging than in other areas of the state. I referenced the unemployment rate, 2.9% statewide. We're almost a half point below that. We're at 2.5. And we have the lowest rate of all of our peers that I talked about before. When I referenced tax rate, that's the same group of peers. Again, it's a good thing. We're a place people want to come work, but short end of that straw is that there's a lot of people that want to work and we need to compete with talent. So that's one side. The other part that I reference, why I think 3% is absolutely necessary, I'll go back to the conversation I had with the sheriff. I already made reference to the things that the state has done with the prison guard positions, that 40+% an increase. Local units of government are doing similar things. 3% is not, by any stretch of the imagination, in my judgment, outside the realm. I think it's going to keep us, my hope is that it keeps us competitive, but I think doing less is going to have significant potential ramifications. I referenced the state budget, not only with 4% across the board for their employees, the prison wages I referenced, but state prosecutors and state public defenders' offices. The state also did targeted provision of increases for those high need positions. That again goes back to why I didn't back out money out of the highway department for attrition. I didn't back money out of the sheriff's department because within the highway department, CDLs, for those of you that are in that space, you know, it's a highly valuable commodity right now. Similarly, if you're a mechanic, a diesel mechanic, very lucrative. We need to have the opportunity to be able to respond quickly and compete. So I truly believe our staff are our greatest asset, and we need to make sure we continue to attract and retain quality staff. Workers' compensation, and it also applies to property insurance. Like a lot of areas within the budget that I'll talk about later, this is an area where we've seen inflationary pressure. Insurance, whether it's health insurance, property insurance, workers' comp, those costs are going up. Highway, paving, and bridge programs, based on our number of lane miles in excess of, total miles in excess of 600, we need to pave about 30 miles of road a year to stay on top of those life cycles. We're planning to pave 29.88 according to our paving plan, and Jim did a very nice job of telling you what roadways and bridges we're going to be working on. He also, for those of you that know Jim, he does a very good job of, Chris earlier today in a meeting said, Jim often uses the analogy, if there's state or federal match where we show up with 10% and they give us 90, he says, just like you would show up with a lot of dimes, he's going to show up with a lot of projects. And we've done very well in that regard, and he lists some of those bigger projects. Parks Small Capital, we started this practice of setting $100,000 annually aside. It's not going to fund big things, but it's going to help us stay on top of routine maintenance, being very transparent about what we're planning on working on as part of that. Nurse Family Partnership, I wanted to, I know this was a discussion point in last year's budget. Start Right before it had been a frequent discussion point. Just wanted to give you a brief update about who we're serving. Encourage everyone to read that. It's really an at-risk population. In fact, I asked one of my staff to reach out to the health department. Is this right? I think they missed a 0 on the median household income. 55% out of a median household income of less than or equal to $6,000. I thought that must be 60. Nope, it's 6. So it's a really important program. I think they're doing well to reach their target of 50 families. And as we discussed at last year's budget, it is at a reduced cost relative to the Start Right program for sure. We've gone through our startup costs, and next year there will be an overall reduction in that program cost as referenced there. Inflation. I alluded to this before. You've seen this chart. I won't belabor it. You can look at it. The only thing that I would say is changed that I wanted to specifically point out to you, and these are just 2 examples. I don't see Jerry Klein still here, but I serve on the City County Information Technology Commission as the chair. This is, Jerry's in the back. Hi, Jerry. These are indicative of the same thing we're seeing with every type of technology, but a significant increase in service costs. Our emergency radio maintenance contract, it's a 5-year contract. This is an area of the sheriff's office budget that we did talk about. We're anticipating that contract to go up $300,000 from $400,000 a year to $700,000. Highway diagnostic software, I had to throw Jim a bone and get him in the budget somewhere, apart from culverts and oil filters and asphalt. They use a lot of technology too. Their costs are going up. And again, it's not a big dollar amount when you talk about $3,800 to $5,700, but it's indicative of what we're seeing with everything. Microsoft Office licenses, all the things that we need to do. So that's why I included that. And then, of course, something as, Kim brought it to my attention. Again, not a huge dollar amount, certainly not the sexiest thing in the budget, but postage. We mail a lot of stuff. And you see, just going back to 2020 to what's projected for 2024, it's 35% increase. Child care and housing, the Extension Education Economic Development Committee, by virtue of the action taken by the county board, is developing, kind of understanding what the county's role should be. They're going to come forward with those recommendations. I just left this section in from last year with a little additional information. There's no money in the budget that I allocated to address any of these issues. Just wanted to update the section with additional information. For those of you that were at the Wisconsin Counties Association, each of these topics were addressed. And in fact, the Counties Association through Forward Analytics just last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, released a new report relative to childcare. Broadband is very similar. There's no money in the budget for broadband expansion, but both for broadband expansion and for childcare and housing, I do, in my narrative, call out that that doesn't mean there's not funding available should you deem these things to be a priority. I am continuing the contingency funding level we've had in previous budgets of $800,000, and there's also that unassigned balance of American Rescue Act funds that I alluded to before that Chris will talk about, and you'll hear a little bit more from Christy later today about our social improvement fund balance and how there's the opportunity to come up with it, to be very planful and come up with a way to deploy that to address needs as well. Nonprofit organizations, they're funded at the same level of the previous year's budget. The county board gave action that I could fund, to direct me to fund them at 100%, but not less, up to 100%, but not less than 92% of their previous year funding. Each are funded at the previous levels. This is the section where I talk about the jail and how we've historically looked at the jail I referenced already, about really taking a hard look at jail population and working with our justice system partners. Give a little bit of past initiatives to talk through what those things have been. I think they've been effective. If you look back to the chart that is on page 35, you'll see, you look back to 2017, we eclipsed a monthly average of daily census of over 400. We're down, in 2021, and there were a lot of other factors at play, but we were down to 250. Now we're right about 272. So those efforts that I lay out in this budget message, I think have served us well. We need to continue them. And I put a couple of areas where I think there's significant opportunity. Correction staffing I referenced. Courtroom audio video, the county board funded updating all of our 8 courtrooms with enhanced AV equipment, which has 2 benefits. First, with respect to inmates, if we have an inmate in a prison institution, let's say we have a female inmate in Tachita that doesn't need to come back, can do the hearing virtually, we need the technology to do it. Not all hearings can be done virtually. The statutes are very clear on when defendants have the right to be there, but to the extent we can make it easy and defendants agree, it serves us well financially. And the second is for attorneys. If you followed within the state bar discussion, or when I talked earlier about prosecutors and public defenders, there's just not enough attorneys willing to take public appointments, which slows cases down. Sheriff Billup, we spoke at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council earlier this month. We have about 30, we had 30 inmates of all of our inmates were post-sentence. So when you talk about 240-ish are still waiting for their case to go through the system. So we really need to make it as easy as possible, remove as many barriers as possible for attorneys to come here and take cases. Our data position, we hired our data officer, our first data officer, earlier this month. She's got her work cut out for her. We're going to start, the long-term vision, of course, is to get key performance indicators, data measures, performance measures for all of our programs across all of our departments. We're going to start in the justice system because that's quite honestly, it's a big tax levy spend. So, and it's a lot of partners, a lot of different individuals and entities at the table. So I think that's where data could serve us well. Alcohol dependency court, we've had a court that worked at OWI court for a number of years. I just include this because this is, again, circumstances changed. There's tax levy that goes into this program. The population that we served has really gone down as the courts have worked to identify what the new population that it's going to serve is really going to look like. But I wanted to be very transparent with all of our partners that if I don't think it's a good investment, I'm going to bring that to the Public Safety Committee and the full board to talk about reallocating those funds. Opioid settlement funds, opportunity, because I haven't allocated a single dollar of those funds in this budget. The county board asked the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council to come up with a recommendation for public safety to review and this board to review, but just want to let you know, no funds have been allocated there. And then the last part is something I referenced before about in previous budgets about alternative placements for inmates that have significant medical costs associated with their stay. I still think that's an opportunity. Not aware of anyone else doing it, but I think Sheriff Billup and I can sit down and maybe we can come up with something. Out-of-home placement of children, I already referenced this. I just want to let some of these dollar figures sink in for everybody. And again, it's another example of inflation that we've seen. The top line, residential care, we've really done well from a staff perspective to work with families and support providers in the community to keep kids in the community if we can and keep them in the least restrictive placement. But residential care placements are for those children in our community that have the greatest needs. They are expensive because the kids have significant needs, the family has significant needs. The cost of those placements last year, and I meant to make a note so I knew the exact dollar amount, but my recollection, it was $179,000 for a residential care placement last year. This year, the cost we've been given through DCF, is $269,205, up over 50%. I also included a level 5 treatment foster care placement. It's the fourth line down. You'll see the average cost of that per year, $300,000. I mean, again, when you talk about what are the core jobs that counties have, this is right at the top of the list when you talk about public safety through the sheriff's office. Placement and care of children, that's one of the things the state says you're doing this. It's important work and it's expensive. So $300,000 placement, I just included that because between that sort of placement, a residential placement or a correctional care placement at the bottom, the top half of the chart really is children in need of protection or services. Correctional care is different. That's children, youth going through the youth justice system. But you'll see the cost. That's Lincoln Hills. That cost has steadily increased as well. It's now $458,000 a year. It does not take many placements of those at those levels to cause significant budgetary stress. So kudos to our social services department. Their overall request was about $500,000 below last year. But you can see the placement request, it's up slightly, but our placement numbers, we're doing a very nice job of trying to work to keep kids in those low placements, reducing from 9 to 6 of residential care. Reductions, both group home care, treatment foster care. Just wanting to point that out, that staff are really working diligently to do that, not only because of not because of the financial impact. That's certainly important. As your administrator, I care about that, but having worked with social services as a lawyer, we're doing what is in the best interest of the children. So, and working with courts to do that. Funding of intergovernmental entities. So I alluded to this before. Marathon County is a member and really the lead member in a number of these organizations. City County Information Technology, their budget request is actually down almost $60,000. The reason for that, it's actually the same concept that I alluded to before about making sure that the cost allocation is fair and equitable. Chair Gibbs and I serve on the CCIT Commission. We spent a lot of time last year trying to drill into what is the best way to ensure that Marathon County, the City of Wausau, and North Central Healthcare are each carrying their fair share of the overall IT budget we have across the three organizations. And that's the reason for that request, why it's dropping. Aging Disability Resource Center. their budget is very easy. It's always been the same number because the intergovernmental agreement says that it cannot be increased without all of the members agreeing. I will tell you, in meeting with Mike and Steve, they can't keep doing that for much longer. They're going to come to the members with a request. I think when Chris gets to the capital section of the budget, you'll see an opportunity. Our proposed capital plan calls for a project that will allow ADRC, should they choose to do it, their board, to move back to the North Central, I should say, move back to the Lakeview Drive campus. And then rather than pay rent to a private landlord of about $150,000 a year, they could pay us, which is just a better use of funds. North Central Healthcare, again, big area of the budget. I referenced this when I talked about debt service. North Central's request went up from $4.7 million to $5.8. There's a good logic as to why this is a good thing. They have to service debt. That increase levy, we found that within our operating levy. That's not debt levy dollars, that's operating levy dollars that are going to North Central, that then they're going to be able to be in a much stronger position to service that debt moving forward. I'm not saying that they're going to be able to do that each and every year, but we're also paying for things that historically we didn't pay for. Again, it's Lincoln Langlade Marathon. As the members, we have crisis assessment response team here in Marathon County. Lincoln doesn't, Langlade doesn't. If we're going to be equitable in our other areas that I just talked about, where we're all paying our fair share, the logic applies in this situation as well. So a lot of those are services we have historically gotten that we haven't allocated funding for. But overall, that isn't a significant increase, but it's covered within the operating levy for Marathon County. And then the last intergovernmental or last organization for dues that I'll talk about is North Central Wisconsin Regional Planning. Slight increase, up $2,000 from last year's budget. So I think that takes me through my presentation on the budget. I won't go through all the graphs relative to tax levy and tax rate. I've already talked about what those numbers are, but we give you that historical information. And I think I'll turn it over to Chris to talk about the capital plan. And again, that is at the end of the budget document. I should say there's one chart that's going to be coming soon. We're still working on the pie charts for the allocation of revenues and expenses, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. It's just additional graphical representation. The budget document also has reviews of each and every department, highlights from 23, and also looking forward to 24. So I know that was a lot. I appreciate your patience and attention. But with that, I'll kick it over to Chris. And if you're following along in your packet at home, it is on page 145.
Okay, thank you. So just a couple key points to note before I really dive into the sheet itself. But as you know, the Workday implementation is ongoing, and just by that I mean that there are multiple phases to it. So the CIP integration piece is set up so that will be in place for next year. So hence the spreadsheet you see in front of you or on your screen there, which is a familiar spreadsheet, but this will ultimately be going away in future budgets. I also want to note that having to dovetail the old with the new like that was a lot of work on finance's behalf, so thanks to them for doing a good job there. The overall capital budget is consistent with your direction in terms of recommending allocating a significant portion of the remaining ARPA funds to the needed projects, which is just over $11 million in total. The total remaining ARPA funds, which Lance referenced, is just over $3 million. And this is the last year for ARPA, so I want to call out a couple of things that are slightly different from typical years. First, just a note on the CIP projects here. Because of their low rollover amount in the last year for ARPA being in play, the CCITC projects are funded through ARPA, whereas normal years they'd be funded out of CIP fund balance. So I made this move because we needed to cover the highway projects with real money because of the GTA calculations, as ARPA is not eligible for that. But in future years, you'll see those projects roll back over into the fund balance. The biggest changes, well, some of the bigger changes are in the rolling stock area. If you've been following this conversation, this is an area where the county had basically kept funding stagnant for about 13 years. And so in various committees, the point's been made many times that what you could buy 13 years ago with that amount of money is not what you can buy today. And so HR and Finance and Property Committee had tasked me with coming up with a policy that would be able to balance the county's fiscal limitations under the levy limit, but also be able to find a way to address inflation when it occurs like it has recently. So what you see there under the rolling stock category that says increased each year by net new construction or the 5-year average annual CPIU, whichever is higher. And so that policy I discussed at HR Finance today, but if you follow it through the years, the net new construction was higher than CPI almost every year until inflation really took a spike in the last couple of years. And so then obviously if CPI was 8% like it was last year, it wouldn't be something that would be easy for the county to address out of the gate, again, because of available funding. So the 5-year average really allows you to capture a trend and mitigate some of that impact while not necessarily closing the gap entirely, but allowing you to keep pace with what's happening in the market. Similarly, another note on the rolling stock policy, the historic one and the newly adopted one, is that within there's a capability for departments, if they have a very large rolling stock item, to not include it within the rolling stock funding that they would typically get on a recurring basis, but listed as a separate CIP project. And a good example of that would be a paver. So a paver machine for highway is a real moneymaker for them, but they're over $600,000 new. So if you tried to throw that into your rolling stock allocation, that would really blow up your annual allocation and keep you from being able to do what you need to do every year. And Jim would say, his goal is to replace 3 plows each year. So in future years, I would anticipate seeing equipment like that showing up as a standalone project for consideration. You'll note too that under the highway reserve funding in rolling stock, this number here is in 3 parts. So the base funding for highway that's been the same for the last 13 years is $957,600. The increase for all of the rolling stock, each department, was 20.8%, which again is trying to capture what we didn't increase over that 13-year period. That was $200,008. So that would be the recurring funding. And now separate from that, Jim had asked within his budget discussion for approximately $1.45 million in rolling stock to address other needs. So that number is not the increased number. It's a $200,000 increase to the base funding and a one-time increase in '24 based on Jim's request through the budget. Let's see. The unfunded projects are on the far left column here under not funded. I want to make the point that unfunded does not mean unworthy of consideration. It's just that the last time I was before you, we had a long list of potential projects, and we had just learned that the CIP rollover was approximately $2.8 million. And when you took out the CCITC portion of that, you were looking at approximately $2.1 million. So what I did was I took the lens of saying, okay, what are projects that you would really say are more have to than want to? Not necessarily projects that we shouldn't do or aren't on our radar, but I tried to boil the capital budget down into something that could bring back to you to say, look, these are the projects that we think need to move forward based on the department's requests and just the individual projects themselves. But there's also projects that are worthy of consideration, but we didn't fund through this proposed capital budget. Another note, and I'm going to hop around just one quick second here, is that when we looked at the central heating plant at UWMC or UWSP Wausau, wherever your affiliation lies, there were two different options at the time, option A and option B. Option A was more of a status quo plan that UWSP Wausau had put together. B was something that the facilities and capital management team put together to say, how would we approach this to make it more of an automated system, folded into the way we handle these types of projects for all other county facilities. And that was a higher cost. And then a question was raised about, is it possible to split that up over a couple of years? So we worked with the vendor who we worked with to get the budget estimate, and then the lead HVAC technician, Steve Bellinger, and Gary Reduns, who recently retired, worked together to figure out what would be the steps you could do to split that up. So we opted for the phased approach, which in year one, in 24, would be a $275,000 project. And that would essentially take the two large boilers that would not quite fill this room, but at least half of it, and change out the burners to a single fuel, so natural gas. That's a cheaper replacement cost. It's a more efficient and available fuel than as a dual fuel, they would be using fuel oil. So there's a fuel oil tank there that we would move away from as backup energy. And then in the second year, the cost would be $550,000. That would replace an old Whirlpool boiler, which by replacing that would negate the need for two other boilers in a separate part of the campus, which have been historically used to limp the campus through summer. But they're also of the era that we have, or had, I should say, in Eastgate Hall, the one that blew unexpectedly. So that era of boiler is not something you want to necessarily replace. And so being able to not have to have those in play is presenting a long-term savings opportunity for that campus, but ultimately for the county, and because we own those buildings. Another note on the other funding column here on the far right. This is largely it's state and federal programs providing matching funds or direct funds. So like for CWA, it would be the FAA providing grant funding or some other funding or match funding for projects there. For the highway projects, that would be what Lance was referencing earlier in terms of state match or potential federal match for some of those projects. I will go back up to the, sorry about that. Oh boy. That really scrolled quickly. All right. So I'll just walk quickly through the plan and to highlight some of the things that made the cut. So the projects at the very top there's the one funded by tax levy and the registration fee. That's the county's annual paving program, which Lance referenced in terms of that 30 plus miles target per year. Then you've got the culvert and bridges aid. These two items here are the only tax levy portions in the capital budget. Then after that, you've got information only, just because we know we have projects out at solid waste and CWA. They're not things that are funded through this plan, but they are good to keep track of, similar to projects that would maybe pop up in other departments that would fit the same sort of enterprise department. Then you have recurring projects. These are just recurring funds that are in the budget every year. Beneath that, you have the technology projects from CCITC. The top, all the way down to voice equipment and phone system upgrade fund. These are recurring funds each year in the budget. And then below that are the project requests for 2024. So these remain the same in terms of having workday enhancements. These are providing more customizations to reporting, more tools to essentially force Workday to kind of bend to the county's will in terms of how we do things so that we get the outputs that we need through the system. Not that it doesn't do the lion's share of that already, but it's that fine-tuning aspect of it. The Move Critical IT Hub off of River Drive. This is a project that would be required should the county move forward and divest itself of the River Drive properties. So the IT hub there would move back towards the library, essentially to then reroute the cabling to the western side of the city, essentially facilities, so that then your main IT hub for providing those services is not in buildings you don't own. The West Side jail cameras are self-explanatory. The City County Asset Management Software, this is another Workday integration that will provide an ability to have a more standardized approach to asset management across both the city and the county. The Assembly Room Microphones project is there. You all deal with those very regularly, so I think you know where that one's coming from. Then you have contract management software. This, again, is to provide a venue, if you will, for contracts to go through in a more standardized and streamlined manner. Not to say that things are being done haphazardly there. It's just that it brings a better organization to the contract management as contracts are done all across the county and in every department. Then the fiber optics project. This is essentially fiber that's been laid and hasn't been turned on yet, and would then turn that fiber on and make it usable for the county. The rolling stock, the $395,000, this is the amount requested by the medical examiner and would include a refrigerated van for a livery service for the Forensic Science Center. In further discussions with the medical examiner, there may be ways to put this together over a couple of years so that you're staggering when you have new vans coming online. Similarly, we are still exploring a lease opportunity through Enterprise to see if that's something that could happen. Now, that amount, I think, would still remain the same even if you could find a lease agreement to get into, because essentially what it would do is cover the acquisition cost and then help the plan move forward and get you to a point where you start gaining the equity through resale of the vehicles at that point where you maximize the recapture of value. Similar to all the other fleets across the county. The facilities and CPZ, or Conservation Planning and Zoning, the overall budget now for the fleet based on the policy that was adopted earlier today would be $60,441. I should say that this is, the amount of the increase was the initial jump was to make up for the 13 years. And I think the intent of the policy that was put together was to say, here's where we would look first, and that would be the net new construction percentage or the 5-year CPI average. If there was a different amount that better fit a fleet approach or was based on some new need that wouldn't necessarily be covered, then you could adjust that. You're not necessarily having to do one thing, basically saying that you have flexibility within that. And I mention it because right now, when you get, or the point of getting into a fleet arrangement is that you start generating equity by recapturing that value. That's something you can control by being in that program itself. However, there are costs associated with it that are outside of your control, and one of those would be maintenance costs. So if you're going to bring cars in for tire replacement or getting your brakes fixed or oil changes, those costs go up over time. So you want to be able to account for that over time as well. And between last year and this year, those maintenance costs doubled. There's still a marginal decrease in the CPZ and facilities fleet, but that was mitigated somewhat by that increase in the market. The parks budget, this $173,460, that is the base funding that they've had for the last 13 years. And then the increase was $36,220. So you see on the right that their annual lease for 24 would be $209,680. Similarly, the sheriff's office has been at $333,696. That's the base funding they've been at. Then you take $69,680 as that catch-up increase, and that gets them to $403,376 in 2024. And then you'd go up from there since you've indexed the amount to something. I mentioned the highway rolling stock already, but just as a reminder, this is not the overall increase at $2 million. This includes $200,000 of an increase, which is the same percentage of their $957,600 base funding, but an additional $1.45 million in rolling stock requests from Jim and the Highway Department. The Forensic Science Center, this is something we're familiar with. You voted on the next phase of design earlier this evening. The $11 million represents the $2 million from the county, $7 million from the state, and the $2 million from the federal government that we're waiting to get word on. There is a gap within that in order to make the project whole, if you will, and that's going through a fundraising project both locally through the community, and we've also begun to talk to other counties in the region about where they might be able to come in and assist the project to get complete and move forward. The fundraising campaign began in earnest, I'd say maybe a month or two ago, but really kicked off this last week with an event that was very well attended by a lot of people, or a lot of foundations in the community, as Lance referenced earlier. But it was a great starting point for those conversations, and so everybody, I think, is feeling very confident about where that's headed. The exterior signage for Lakeview campus, this is still looking at all the changes that have happened there in terms of where departments have moved. North Central's moved a lot of different things, and the campus as a whole is not what it has been. Currently, there's a bunch of temporary signs there, but as you kind of get that campus to its final stage, updating the signs to more permanent signs that are going to last over time, be lighted so people can see them at night, things like this are going to be a part of the wayfinding throughout the campus that you want because of the public coming out there and needing to find their way one way or the other. The 1100 Lakeview Drive construction, I made a note that this one is adjusted, and I spoke a bit about this at HR Finance the last couple of meetings. But essentially, we looked at, again, when we're looking at other projects and funding or not funding, I sat down with one of our project planners and said, okay, what can we do to this thing to try to make it more simple? Our guidance for the project overall was minimal renovation, and that's really what it was. There are things within, when you have a project like this, that really presents an opportunity because there's no one in the offices. You're already tearing some things down. You're tearing out ceilings. This is the time where you can get in and do a lot of these other things and have minimal disruption. And also, you can harness some efficiencies because you've got construction crews and subcontractors on site right now working. That said, we looked at the IT upgrades that were associated with the project, and the IT in the facility is not going to fail imminently or anything like that. It works as it is today. Could there be an upgrade down the line? Yes. Is this a cost that we're deferring to a future year? Not necessarily. This is something that could be maintained into the near future, and that's roughly half of the decrease of that $1.1 million that we cut out. The rest of it was taking areas that are, there's an old kitchen area, which is a sizable portion on the western side of that building, that when you get through the HVAC upgrades that are going to be starting soon in a separate but related project, it's not really broken down into, say, office space. And so there was a design approach to say, can we make this more of an office space environment? It'd still be a sort of a gray box or white box approach, not specific to anybody's need. Like we sat down with departments or with ADRC and said, what do you actually need if you were to move here, so that we could make sure the design reflected that. But so rather than making that more detailed, if you will, we boiled it down to the essentials, essentially. And between that and removing some other aspects like a new door here or there, or maybe putting in a transom window in certain areas to pull more light through the building, we got rid of a lot of those to, again, cut the project down by $1.1 million. So when I brought this forward for the initial phase of design, I didn't have a final cost, and we had some conversations about that, and I'd said, as a real rough estimate looking forward, I didn't think it would be over $4 million. And, when we first looked at this and said, okay, if you did everything, it would be 4.9, and that also includes some just inflationary increases and equipment cost increases. But after we did what we did and managed to bring it down, I was happy to see that we were able to still stay under that $4 million target, even though it was a rough estimate at the time. The chillers project at the building the library is in, this is one I've mentioned before, so I'll just be quick about it. But essentially, the entire sort of chilling system and air handling system is at end of life. And so whether this project moves forward or not, there's a sunk cost in its status quo, in a sense that if you didn't move this particular project, you still have a little over $1 million in terms of equipment costs to replace what's there and maintain the status quo. The other part of that would be that each year you're still paying over $50,000 a year in a water bill. So if you translate that over the expected life of the new HVAC equipment using the status quo, you're still looking at $1.25 million just in water bills, which would go away with the new chiller project. So the other parts of this is that when you have older equipment, it's harder to find parts, it's harder to work on, so it's more of less tangible benefit, but it allows staff to identify problems, fix them more easily, and more easily find parts for the pieces that may have gone wrong. The unfunded projects here is just the east side parking lot outside this window to your, well, behind you, in front of you, one way or the other. This is a lot that we didn't fund because the question was raised, well, we have a recurring parking lot fund as it is. That fund is not there to replace entire parking lots. It's there to address failures within drainage systems in parking lots. It's to address potholes, things like that. But it raised the question to say, well, if we're not totally sure how we want to approach that, it might make sense to say, let's just figure out what's a lot we want to replace and what's the sort of maintenance for lots across the county, and then lump them into one rather than have a separate project. The Lakeview Professional Plaza, this is really wrapped up in sanitary lines and plumbing within the building. And this is a building, too, that the county's invested heavily, well, I won't say heavily, but invested a great deal into renovating and bringing up to speed. And the important part about that is that there are programs in there. There's special education, there's birth to 3, but there's available space there that the county could lease out to other agencies. That said, because of the situation that the sanitary lines are in, which are, eventually they're deteriorating to the point, and the worry is that they would start to collapse and pose greater issues there. And the internal plumbing is still 2-inch cast iron plumbing, that if you started to add more people in there, you would stress the capacity of the system. So this isn't something that needed to be addressed necessarily next year, but the reason we pushed it forward is to get the design cost done was because we knew that ARPA was in play and we didn't know what the board was going to be thinking of doing, to say this is something that, should you want to do it, it would be available. We would have that construction cost estimate for you. But also this is something that if we address it in 25, we'll still have that design in place, and then you can just apply a couple multipliers to get to the cost estimate for construction. But there's definitely revenue opportunities there once that building is complete and the sanitary and plumbing is in a situation where you can bring more people in. The next chunk of projects are all highway projects. The only one to really call out is the $957,567. This is County Highway J resurfacing. That amount, again, is the county's share of the overall project. And we took it out of highway reserve because, again, this low CIP rollover amount said, okay, we need to figure out what we're going to use that for. And so the vast majority of the projects are funded through the CIP rollover, but this one is large enough that it would have caused an issue with that amount that we had to work with. So that one was being pulled out of the highway reserve. The $105,000, this was a parking lot that was previously listed under ARPA, but we moved it out of ARPA because it's a facility improvement, which makes it a GTA eligible calculation. So you can throw that into the county's contribution for GTAs, and that will benefit the average. The hydro seeder, it's a smaller funding amount, and there is potential for municipalities to rent this as they need it, and there is a need for it, but it wasn't a need to have, so that's why it's on the unfunded list there. But again, anything in that column does not mean unworthy of consideration. Similarly, the Eastgate Hall project presents 3 real distinct areas where you'd want to improve the building, from the exterior being the windows and siding, and those 2 projects are tied together, to the interior where you have the lighting and electrical and the acoustic tile up in the ceiling. Those 2 are tied together, and the flooring. So when you looked at any of those 3, the flooring was more of the high priority. If you've been in there anytime recently, you'll notice that a lot of the flooring is starting to get chewed up and it's deteriorating more quickly. It's definitely at end of life. The leveling agent underneath it is essentially pulverized. So it's a heavily trafficked in terms of people's feet. And so starting with that is what the priority was, and that's why that's carved out as just one aspect of the overall project. The Dells of the Eau Claire, Jamie made a correction to this earlier today. The actual dump station would be $35,000, not $135,000. So that's a smaller amount, obviously, for the dump station. But the reason it was over here is because the need to have a dump station was triggered by a change in state regulations. And so if it wasn't necessarily a have to do, it was something you could say, well, we can adjust how the campsites are available, essentially, to not go past that line and then not require that investment at this time. The Big O Plain campgrounds, same situation. Are there, and I should mention too that Jamie put together a return on investment and justification document that's in the HR packet from today. If you want to look at how they're looking at how you would approach return on investment for these projects that were unfunded in this plan. But the adding bathroom and shower facilities is definitely a nice thing. I'm an avid camper myself, and they are nice when you get to the campgrounds with them, but it didn't, I had to be consistent with the lens that I used. So the next two are funded because they're failing essentially septic systems. One of them is a block construction bathroom facility at Cherokee Park, and the other is a 9 Mile rec area septic system. And that the 9 Mile septic system is at end of life and needs to be replaced. But what it will also do in replacing it is provide the actual capacity within that facility so that larger groups can go out there, and it presents an opportunity for more revenue that hasn't been there because Parks has had to limit who can reserve that space because the septic system was not going to be able to handle them if they were to hold an event. The West Side Master Plan, this one was pulled out primarily because we know that plans have come forward and there's been questions raised in terms of are they traditional CIP or not. They're long-term for sure. They are higher cost in a lot of cases, so they fit those bills in terms of a traditional CIP project. But at the end of the day, it's not a real tangible asset like you would think of. It's a plan. And so the question that has been posed before, or at least discussed, has been, is there a different way that the county wants to handle funding plans of this type, whether it be West Side Master Plan type plans or the comprehensive plan or the groundwater plan was last year. Any sorts, there's plans like this across the county that tend to be updated regularly. Farmland preservation plan is another one. So asking, should we handle it separately or should we continue to handle it like this as a CIP project? Could it be like rolling stock and have a specific carve out? Until the question is answered in a way that the county is satisfied with, it made sense to pull that out for now. The TRC for the sheriff's office, I'll just reiterate here that this was a project that had kind of been lingering in the plan for some years at about $3.5 million for a new facility. But having going out there and toured the facility and walked through what the space looks like now, that and a storage facility they have out there, it was pretty clear to us that you're not going to really get what they already have for $3.5 million new. It would be a higher cost. So then we sat down with them and said, what are you really looking for and what are your needs? And after discussing with them, we could get this done for approximately $1.65 million to renovate the facility they have now, reskin it, insulate it, upgrade the storage facility to give them more operational flexibility in those spaces, and so put them in a position they want to be in at a lower cost. I already covered the UWSP system here, so that's the 275 out of CIP rollover. And at the very bottom, you can see that there's the total CIP rollover at 2.862. Then there's CIP funds for personnel and contract services. These are in there every year as well. So like the project planners that in facilities that execute these projects and manage them, their positions are funded out of it, as are some positions for the Workday implementation, or one of them anyway. So the CIP rollover was, there's none there, but at the end of the day, we ended up being able to only use 11.1 million of ARPA of the total unallocated of 14.3 million. So that's where that $3.135 million comes from, as in unallocated ARPA per what's in front of you now. Now, obviously that can change, but in terms of what's proposed, that's an amount of money that's left over for any purpose that would fall under that lost revenue category, which is exceptionally broad. So, and that is the CIP plan.
All right, thanks, Chris. Next, we'll have Christy go through the 2 pages that are preceding the CIP plan. And really, this is, when I talked before about how Workday is kind of a fresh start, this is one of those examples of a fresh start. And Christy can explain in more detail if you want, but this is my high-level explanation. When we redid our chart of accounts and we redid our budgets, the term Christie's used is things got mapped differently. So that 5-year department comparison that has been in part of our budget book since, I don't know, 1998, it doesn't jive with how Workday is going to present documents moving forward and present reports. This is more what's going to come out of Workday. I might have stole your thunder there, but you can, we wanted to at least give you in the budget document a idea of revenue, expense, and tax levy. And after she does this, there's another document, not in the budget book, but it's the last couple pages of your packet. There was a question relative to fund balance, specifically social improvement fund balance. We have Colleen and Krista here from Social Services and Christy, and they worked to provide an explanation through a memo about what it is, how the balance has grown, and then I'll wrap up with, this is again another one of those areas where you as the board have the opportunity to be planful about it's really an opportunity. It's that balance has grown. Christy will talk about what it is and how you as a board want to come up with a policy relative to utilization.
All right, I'm going to go through, not quickly, but briefly, the department charts. So as you know, the 2023 budget was the last time we used our old legacy system to create the budget. And what happened was that was built on agency funds, which mirrored our department funds that we've had for 29 years. And so when we went to Workday, Workday works on a different allocation, which are called cost centers. They also relate back directly to departments, but the cost centers may have rolled up expenses and revenues in a way that more is useful for operations within a department. So in the case of moving the old legacy system where the 2023 budget was established and adopted to a new set of chart of accounts, which is Workday, some of it isn't mapping exactly to where it was in the past. It's a little confusing, but I do want to show you how we will be presenting the budget in the future. I think once you look at it and we explain a little bit why we have it built that way, I think you'll find it to be informative. So what this is taking on the right-hand side is the tax levy as per our old legacy system where we established it. We have moved it to Workday, but the mapping again may map slightly differently than it was in the previous legacy system. So you will see some of the tax levy differences where the variances are larger than we would anticipate, and some of that's due to the fact that things are being mapped to a department where they were not mapped in 2023 or previous budgets. But if you take a look, this is actually your general fund, and it's showing you the revenue and revenue budgeted revenues, the budgeted expenditures, and then the 2024 tax levy per department. And then on the right-hand side, again, it's going to show you what we were able to establish back in Workday as the 2023 tax levy. Again, when you go back to the legacy system, some of those numbers will be slightly different, so you do see some increases or decreases that aren't going to map directly to what we were able to do in their budgets to try to manage and control the cost overall. Two of the highlights are that you will see in the department chart, the general fund used to include our parks department, but in the case of the parks department, a lot of the projects that you see are camping. We've talked about the ice rinks, we've talked about 9 Mile, the soccer fields. We have moved them to their own established parks fund. And so with the next page, what I will do is just show you how in the future our Workday presentation will be for budgets. And this is how we are now currently mapping our reports. So the general fund, again, if you scroll back up to the page before that, that includes the operations portion of all the departments that were listed. With that, we did pull parks out and we made it its own established parks fund. We are going to run that one more like an enterprise fund, but since it is governmental in nature, it will be reported in the governmental operations for the county. Social Improvement Fund, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but that is the operating portion of the Social Services Department. So it actually will contain the operations of the Social Services Department minus the grants that they receive from the federal and state government. Parks, we just talked about. The Grants Fund is the new one. So Grants Fund, if you take a look, and you'll see in the top three, the General Fund, the Social Improvement, and the Parks Fund, those are the levy portions that are contained within that. So we're going to talk in just a brief minute about what happened with the Social Improvement Fund and why we have a fund balance there. What we're trying to do is segregate out the operating portion of the Social Improvement Fund, the operating portion of the Parks Fund, and those portions of those businesses that are solely grant funded are being put into the Grants Fund. Again, they're all governmental entities doing governmental work, so they will be reported in the government activities side of the county's financial statements. So that is kind of the new part. This is what you will see when we are putting our budgets together from Workday. Then we have our Debt Service Fund, which is, we talked about already, and so you'll see the tax levy has increased significantly in there, and that's covering a portion of the debt service that is due for 2024, and that does include your principal and interest. It does not include the airport funded debt. The airport funded debt will be within the airport's budget itself. Going on, we have our Capital Projects Fund, which we've just talked about and went through all those projects. Airport Fund is established as a separate governmental entity, and the finance committees of both Portage and Marathon County met last night and approved their budget as well, and the one amendment they made is reflected within these figures. Highway Fund, we talked quite a bit about the Highway Fund. That fund is an enterprise fund, and it is also has a levy of a little over $10 million this year. Landfill Fund is another enterprise fund and has no tax levy associated with it. And then the county runs two insurance funds, and we call those internal service funds because really what it is if you can imagine an insurance company that does health insurance, dental, workers' comp, that is run within the Employee Benefits Fund. And then we have a separate little insurance fund called the Property and Casualty Fund. And so those are the two internal service funds that really run the insurances for Marathon County. And then lastly, we post the ADRC. The county contributes the little over $395,000 to the ADRC, but the ADRC is a separate organization. We are the fiscal manager for them, so we are presenting that within this to give you a demonstration of what the new structure looks like in Workday. And that's really all I had for this evening. We are excited to put something together that we think is going to hopefully be more meaningful. And I also want to thank not only my staff, HR staff, county administration, but every department has had to learn lots and lots of new things, and we've had a lot of department people within the department that are really participating and helping us out immensely to make sure that we're trying to get that done together. So it's been kind of hectic but fun. So I just want to thank all of them, all the finance staff and all of the departments for that. At this time, I don't know if there would be any questions, but this is really what we wanted to present this evening. Yep, this is the budget part. So I got to step back to 2019 next. So if there's anything on the 2024 budget, then I'm going to. One of the county board supervisors had a question. The 2022 financial audit is on the county's website, and they were taking a look at that. We had a review in August from our auditors, and they had questioned. I'm going to probably put my glasses on, or I'm going to expand this. On the Social Improvement Fund, because the ending fund balance in the Social Improvement Fund has been increasing over the course of about four to 5 years, and they had a question on that. So we thought we would just do a little government and accounting 101, and we are going to not keep you real late, but we want to make sure that you understand where we're at. And again, this was in the financial statements from 2022. But what it is that the Social Services Department is represented in the 2022 financial statements as the Social Improvement Fund. And the Social Improvement Fund is a special revenue fund with governmental activities. And again, I'm going to put my glasses on. And those are specifically accounted for to account for the proceeds of specific revenue resources that are legally restricted for specific purposes or activities other than revenues from restricted for the acquisition or construction of fixed capital assets. So on the previous page, we have a capital improvement fund that's specifically for capital improvement. So the Social Services Department fits nicely into that. The ADRC is a separate governmental entity, even though they provide health services and human services for people. They would not be reported in that because they, again, are a separate governmental entity. With that, the state of Wisconsin also states, Department of Revenue, that it is a special revenue fund is to be used to account for the proceeds of specific revenue sources that are legally, I just read that one. That's why we want to put them there. But I just want to give you a context that they also state that county by county may have different revenue sources or other ordinances that control what goes in and out of that social improvement fund. So that's what we want to convey to you, is that the state of Wisconsin also recognizes those and recognizes counties may have different resolutions, ordinances in order to fund and maintain those accounts. With that, we had an ending increase in fund balance for that fund of $3,592,415 at the end of last year. So the question was, well, what makes that up? So we're just going to go through a brief analysis. We took a look at that for 2022, and there are more than these programs, but there are 8 programs that the Social Services Department does that have a county contribution to them. And in most cases, and I'm going to look at Colleen because she's going to tell me if I'm saying something right or wrong, but most of those are going to be a tax levy contribution. You'll see that in the budget book. It was a little, for 2023, it's 7.4 million, and it's slightly under 7 million for 2024 in the proposed budget. So that we went ahead and take a look. Okay, what's going on in these? We call them organizations. Now they're going to be programs or they're going to be grants within the Social Services Department. There are 8 of them, and they're pretty self-explanatory. What we did is we took a look and we said, okay, there's about 4 of these programs that have they're slightly under budget. And what is the result of that? Why are they? Most of the result of the under budget or actual under budget is temporarily vacant staff positions, or there may be contracts that are being paid out for less than what we were budgeted. So you may have a contract for $100,000. Based on the services that are provided, you may have only needed to be billed for $90,000. So those are the things. Those are in 4 of the items. And typically in most of those make sense. There's social work administration, agency overhead, economic support. Those are all ones that we have to account for, and that in some cases we do get matched from the state of Wisconsin because we are showing them that we have these additional funds that are managing the fiscal and other responsibilities of the department. Then we went ahead and took a look and said, okay, there are much larger balances in the youth justice and the child protective services. What's going on there? And in those cases, again, there were multiple staff vacancies, and also what the other major item is the decrease in the number of actual cost for foster care. And in each case, both the youth justice and child protective services, the higher cost budgeted placements were not underutilized. So the actual cost for putting a child in a higher level service was less than what we had budgeted. And if you go back to the budget document that we just talked about, I think it's on page 36, you'll see the dollar amount for each of those. You also see what our average 10-year cost is for actually what children were placed in those levels of foster care for the years in the past. So that's what it is. And if you see on the one, Krista, I think it was juvenile justice and correctional care. Thank you. I want to make sure I'm saying the words right. That cost in 2024 will be almost $500,000 per child. So definitely, if you're budgeting 1, or you're budgeting 1.2, I think was our average, and you're going to be under that, you've already picked up a few $100,000 there. Now, the other thing is true that if you budget for one child all year and you now have 2 children there, you've just doubled that cost. So it can go up and down and fluctuate. So that's really where all of it was when we took a look at 2022. So then if you say, well, that's just 1 year, you guys, what is it that we really are? So you'll see the under budget. We're under budget by $3.3 million. Now, in these programs, not only are we going to be contributing mostly tax levy, but they're also funded by the state of Wisconsin for the programs, because they're a partner in that and they're going to assist us in that. So what we did, and then the second page of this is just what we did to summarize what about the previous years and where can we get the number to try to figure out what the county's part is. You're saying that this is part of county's revenues that are participating in these programs. What really makes that part up? What is the county's part of that? And that's where the Social Services Department has provided us the information that they have, and it's a little small, but it is at the end of your packet. So we went back and took a look at those total amounts that were actual under budget for the last 4 years, and then took a look at what percentage would be a county portion of that program. And so you can take a look on each one of the 4 years. You'll have the first column for 2019 is the budget versus actual, what we spent less than budget, the county portion of that we can attribute to the county's funding for these programs, and that we're coming up with a county share. So we've done that for the last 4 years, and again, in each of those years, it's temporary vacancies and salaries. Contract expenditures less than that of what we budgeted, and those were in the youth justice for some of the services. So primary in that youth justice one, primarily those are the contracts that were, we spent less than what we budgeted. And then at the end, you can take a look at the far right corner. If you take this and look at what we think the county contribution is for each of the programs in each of the years, you come up with a cumulative county share of $6.3 million. So if you want to take a look at that total dollar amount, what do we think that is? How do we think, is it part of that really could be moved back to the county? You're looking at what the county's stake in that would be, and this is what we've come up with. Also, I wanted to point out on the first page of the memo, we wanted to get you to pretty close to the number that's in the financial statements. Now, there's a little interest income and other items, but with the excess over revenues over expenditures of a little over 3.5, most of that, or 3.3, was these 8 programs. So with that, that's kind of what we wanted to do, is just provide you that summary, and that's really all I had at that point. Yeah.
If I may, Mr. Chair. So Christy gave you the numbers. I went to law school to get out of math class. I'm going to do a little bit of kind of more on the story side, on the background. So I looked back, and this financial analysis is informative, again, of the opportunity that you have. Staff have done a very good job to manage those costs, work to reduce placements. I'll give you an example. Back when I started in 2020 as the administrator, I can talk about some of the probably forced vacancy numbers that contributed to this. The county board challenged me to come up with a budget repair plan because we didn't know what was going to be the impact of the pandemic. And essentially, I held open positions unless they were essential. Department heads needed to ask. So there were a lot of expenses held open, and I challenged people to look at the contracts that Christy just talked about, contractual services. So that's a little bit more background. The other thing I'll say is right before 2019, I think context is always helpful. The county board, in adopting its budget, in adopting the 2018 budget, threw almost $500,000 of additional funding into child placements. If you think back, I know that's a long time ago, 2018 feels like a lifetime. At that point, I was fresh leaving Corporation Counsel's office, and the thing that we were talking about at the county board at the time was we need a lot more, look at what we're experiencing with the opioid and methamphetamine epidemics, and one of the areas where we were seeing a lot of concern and a lot of increased cost was child placements. So I just pulled up the 2018 budget that was proposed and ultimately adopted, and it was $438,097 of additional spending was transferred for child placements. So my sense, and again, providing extra additional context here, is the reason perhaps underlying some of this opportunity that we have is we've done a really good job to try to control the placements, but we were all also just coming out of, I mean, I remember in Corporation Counsel's office in 3 years, in 2 years, we tripled the number of out-of-home placements we had. Like we had, I remember having cases that we went from, I can't remember, Krista, how many CHIPS petitions, but when we started working together, it was like 50, and then it was 216. So that frame of reference probably played into kind of what do we need to budget for? Because like Christy said, if you're off on a correctional care placement, or if you're off on, a couple of residential care placements, you're really, nobody wants to be in the position as a department head to come to me to say, Lance, we need to go to the county board to ask for a transfer from the general fund to cover a shortfall. So again, the overall message is very similar from my perspective. And of course, you as the policymakers have the choice, but I think it's you have an opportunity to be planful with these funds. In talking with Christy before the meeting, I think there's at least some other counties have had a similar experience, Dane County, and talking with our auditor, trying to understand. They said similar things happening in Dane County. There are some various ways you can approach these sort of funds. I reached out to some of my colleagues. Do you essentially want to utilize this as do you want a deficit spend to set a target moving forward? I would, again, recommend we do that planfully, maybe not this year, but find out what the right target should be and do that. I didn't find any colleagues that have done that for their equivalent of the social improvement fund. Do you want to have a portion of it roll over into CIP? That will be what will happen if you do nothing. It will roll over and be available in the year following the audit. Or do you want to come up with another plan for it? I know there's been discussions. I met with Supervisor Marshall, was that last week, talking about health insurance. And I said before, we're going to need to have, if you want to go self-funded, a $3 million area. You could do that. Met with Supervisor Sherfinsky after the last recent meeting, talking about some needs within a municipality within the county, some significant costs that they can't shoulder themselves. Do you want to set up an environmental impact fund sort of account? You have a lot of options. My 2 cents is always, we are better served when we take a minute and come up with a really planful approach. But I know that's a lot. We gave a lot of presentation about the budget, and I know Chair Robinson wants to wrap up because it's no longer the county administrator's budget. HR Finance took that budget today. They accepted it earlier this afternoon. And I know Chair Robinson wants to talk through some process ideas he's had. From the staff perspective, my final message is we realize while the budget is perhaps off of our plate, we are still here to help. And I know Chair Robinson, again, when he goes through the process of that you adopted earlier with your budget timeline, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself and, of course, the standing committee chairs that Chair Robinson will talk about as you continue your budget discussions. But truly a pleasure to present the budget to you. Staff really did an exceptional job putting it together. I'm very proud, but certainly happy to help you continue to come up with what you want the final budget to be.
I think one part that is critical that we understand, and that is we can budget for these out-of-county placements a number. But when it comes to reality, and the reality is if the court orders a child into a protective placement, they don't care what the county budgeted. They really don't. What's in the best interest of the child, the county's going to pay the bill. And so if that child is placed in whatever facility, the county just has the obligation of paying the bill, irregardless of what we budgeted for. And so understanding that is critical in context of, again, how we got to where we got to. So I would turn it over to Supervisor Robinson for some closing remarks and some processes as we move forward on the budget. Supervisor Robinson, please.
So thank you. I want to start out by thanking Administrator Leonard, Deputy Administrator Holman, and Christie for their work on the budget. So earlier today, the Finance Committee accepted the budget, which means now it's the county board's document. So what we're looking to do is we're trying to continue working through the committees, and beginning next Tuesday when ERC meets, Wednesday Health and Human Services, Thursday Infrastructure and EEDC. The following week it'll be Public Safety and Human Resources, Finance and Property. We're looking for you to look at the budget and make recommendations. The Finance Committee will be meeting on October 11th, and we've got some work relative to the KIP, and then again on the 16th. We're asking that as a result of the initial review, and we'll send this out to you, that we would have any concerns or suggested changes to the HR, to the Finance Committee by the 13th, and then we'll take those up on the 16th. The 16th is a magic date because we have to publish a budget for the public hearing. So we will be meeting at 8 o'clock as a Finance Committee on the 16th to go through and make some changes, giving that information to Christie, who has to have it published in the paper on the 19th. And that will set us up for the public hearing on November 2nd. Each committee will have another round in early November, or another opportunity to review and make recommendations to the Finance Committee and ultimately for consideration of the board. In the Finance Committee, we're asking that any amendments be submitted by November 6th. The committee will review those on the 8th, and the county board will be considering the budget on the 9th. So the critical dates for the entire board would be November 2nd, the public hearing, November 9th, the final approval. We're trying to give as much time as possible to the committees and the public, and again, we'll forward this to you. We would ask that you work through the committees, and that if you have questions, concerns, contact either Administrator Leonard or myself versus the department heads, and he's the one that prepared the budget, and ultimately now it is the county board's budget, and we'll try to get an answer or provide you information, give you an answer right away, or provide information at a later date. But again, we'll send out information to you relative to committee involvement and then the critical dates.
So I think a little more information. So each of the standing committees in their next meetings will be getting a in-depth review of the budget as it relates to departments of oversight. So if you happen to have, for example, the infrastructure budget or infrastructure committee, you will get an in-depth presentation on the infrastructure's budget, and along with that will be a overview of the CCIT portion of the budget. What we're asking you to do is to pay attention to that information, because that's where we're asking each of the standing committees to do the delve into that budget and that oversight responsibility on those committees. And if there's suggestions and or potential amendments that you want to offer those up to the HR Finance Committee on the various dates that we're talking about. And then the Finance Committee will take those up and make its recommendations to the full board. So again, each of the standing committees will get an opportunity to get a in-depth budget look at each of the departments of jurisdiction that committee has oversight over. And that will happen starting next week, and will conclude the following week when the final standing committees will take up each of those budget items. So with that, that's all we had for you today. Is there nothing too serious? Just a small amount of information. We are down to announcements and/or requests. We have any announcements and/or requests. Clerk needs signatures from ERC, HR Finance, Health and Human Services, Public Safety, and Infrastructure. They will be on the back table in the middle section. Any other announcements and/or requests? Okay, we are down to item number G, 17. Supervisor Vensky with the motion, Supervisor Zhang with a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.